This is our seminar on our webinar on the search for a vaccine in the age of COVID-19. It's actually the 10th webinar in our series on the age of COVID-19, co-sponsored by the Norman Lear Center and the Writers Guild of America West and the Writers Guild of America East. The Norman Lear Center in normal days would be right there in that lovely neo-Tudor pile behind me. Unfortunately, we've all spread out, and that's one of the things that we have in common with everybody watching in this time of a pandemic. I'm Marty Kaplan. I'm the director of the Norman Lear Center. And what the Lear Center has been doing for 20 years is following the thread of the idea that stories matter. Stories make a difference. Storytellers have power. They affect what we know, what we believe, even what we do. That is an awesome power. And when it comes to a topic like life and death, matters of medicine and health, imagine the importance of getting it right because of the impact it has on people, because truth matters too. And Hollywood Health and Society is the name of the program at the Norman Lear Center that's also been going for 20 years, in which we, in partnership with the Writers Guild, enable storytellers to have access to amazing experts to talk about their fields so that the storytellers will be able for free to tell a story which is compelling and dramatic and entertaining, but also accurate so that they wield their power responsibly. And imagine how important that is in an area like vaccines, which is so much the topic of misinformation, disinformation. It's an arena of conflict and battle. It's a kind of boxing ring. And why not have the truth have a say in that battle? That's what we're doing tonight. We're glad you're here. There'll be a chance to ask questions, and the moderator, to whom I am now going to pass the baton tonight, is the immediate past president of the Writers Guild of America East. Please say hi in your own virtual way to Michael Winship.
Thanks, Marty. The ever shaggier Michael Winship. Good evening to all of you and welcome. This is, as Marty said, the latest in this series of discussions we've been having over the past few weeks about the coronavirus pandemic and its impact on health and societal issues of concern to all of us, but especially those in the storytelling community. Know too that this is all being recorded and will be available online in the days ahead for anyone who wants to take a look. All our past sessions are there too. There are many of you on this call, and know that you can submit questions throughout this, but our tentative plan is to present your questions, some of your questions, for our guests during the latter part of this webcast. You'll see the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You should go through that to submit your questions. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues around the world, we've reached the point of close to 8 million cases worldwide and nearly 450,000 deaths. Of course, that number is changing by the minute, as it seems as the number of candidates for vaccines to fight against the disease. At last count, according to Friday's Los Angeles Times, there are 160 vaccines in development around the planet. 5 of the laboratories doing this work have been given the go-ahead for a trial vaccine by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So we're very privileged to have one of those labs represented here tonight. Dr. Dan Baruch is the head of the Center for Virology and Vaccine Center, at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, which is a research and teaching hospital that's part of Harvard Medical School in Boston. He's also a professor of medicine there. His work on vaccines has involved him in the pursuit of vaccines for HIV and Ebola. And in 2016, he and his team produced a vaccine to treat the 2016 Zika virus in what was then a record-breaking 180 days. Also with us is NEAL BAER, widely experienced TV writer, executive producer, showrunner. Among his credits are Designated Survivor, Under the Dome, Law and Order SVU, and ER. And on top of those credits, Neil himself is an MD, former science reporter and author, a public health expert and advocate. So welcome to you both. How is it that the two of you know each other?
I met Dan through Harvard Medical School. Hello, everybody, too.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Because I've been really interested in HIV and the research for years. And we started it on ER with the Jeannie Boulet storyline with Gloria Rubin. And we did it on Designated Survivor with undetectable means untransmissible. So I really wanted to know about Dan's work because he's a leader in not only COVID vaccines, but HIV vaccines too.
Terrific.
And if I take us a few years even before that. So first, hi everyone, I'm Dan Baruch. Great to meet you all. I wish we could be in the same room together, and perhaps in the future we can be, but good evening everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I didn't meet Neil at that time, but I certainly became a NEAL BAER fan when I was a first-year medical student. And I believe Neil was a fourth-year medical student. We were both at Harvard Medical School. We didn't know each other in the school, but when I was a first-year medical student, that was, I believe it was the second season of ER, a wildly popular show. And so all of the first-year medical students would gather in the dorm common room once a week to watch ER. And every week that went by, we would understand a bit more of the jargon in the show. So it was a real pleasure to meet Neil a number of years later in a different context.
Well, Dr. Baruch, I want to begin with you. When did you and your team first become involved in the quest for a vaccine, and how has that effort accelerated over the last few months?
So thanks, Michael. So as Neil mentioned, we have been studying many viral diseases. And we've been involved in studying how viruses work and how the body can fight against these viruses. And we have developed candidate vaccines for a number of pathogens such as HIV and Zika that are currently in clinical trials being tested. Our lab has never worked on coronaviruses before. And of course, no one has worked on COVID-19 before January this year because it wasn't actually discovered. So we started seeing the troubling headlines in the news in the last week of December and the first week of January, like many of you perhaps, that there was a cluster of mysterious pneumonias in Wuhan in China. And in the first week of January, there was a cluster that grew to 41 individuals and one person died. And that was alarming because that seemed to be an exponential rate of rise of infected individuals. Now 41 would hardly be a blip on the radar screen because of how profoundly this virus has spread throughout the globe and has affected each and every one of our lives in such a profound way. But in the first week of January, a cluster of 41 mysterious cases of pneumonia was actually quite alarming. In addition, it wasn't clear that they all had a contact source. There was a suspicion they might have originated from an animal market in Wuhan, but it wasn't completely convincing because not everyone had contact with that market, only some people. So we were concerned from the first week of January that this might be a pathogen that could have pandemic spread because of the troublesome features of rapid spread without a clear source, which would lead us to believe that there might be person-to-person transmission of this virus. Of course, within a few weeks, that was very, very clear. So on January 10th of this year, I'll remember that date because it was a clear starting date, we actually had our annual Baruch Lab retreat, whereas once a year I gather my entire group together and we basically have a seminar and a dinner together, and we discuss all the work that we've done over the last year and all the plans for the next year. And we are a very busy research group doing many aspects of HIV vaccines, HIV cure strategies, Zika virus vaccines, tuberculosis. But nevertheless, then we were discussing on that day how there was this cluster of mysterious pneumonias in China and how this actually might be a virus that could spread and might need a vaccine. But also on that particular day, we couldn't do anything about it because we didn't have the vaccine and we also didn't have the sequence. So it was a fairly brief discussion, but I remember it very clearly because that same evening is when the Chinese investigators released the sequence of the virus online. And we started working on it immediately. So we gathered a team together and started work on it on our computers, ironically, all in our separate rooms on that weekend. But we started working on the sequence that same night and analyzing the sequence and worked on it throughout the weekend and developed candidate sequences for vaccines. So on Monday, January 13th, when we were back in the lab, in the offices, then we actually started the actual experimental work of producing vaccines for this new virus pathogen. It wasn't called COVID-19 then, but over the next several weeks, an incredible thing happened, which is we started this project, and as we were starting this project, we watched this virus explode in China, which was frightening to say the least. And it solidified our resolve that this is a vaccine that needed to be made. We also were in touch with our industry partner that has the capacity to manufacture large-scale vaccines for clinical trials, and they were equally convinced that this needs to happen. So we started putting all the pieces in place for a potential large-scale research and development program very, very early, starting on the very first day the sequence was developed. And then as the work continued to progress, in terms of generating candidate vaccine constructs, down selecting them, conducting animal studies to test their effectiveness, and plans to go into human clinical trials, then we saw the virus not only explode in China, but explode in the Middle East, in Western Europe, and in the United States. First,
I'm sorry, what do you mean when you say sequences, and what exactly does it take to make a vaccine? I mean, how is your approach different from various other approaches that are taking place around the world?
So there are, as you pointed out, there's over 100 different vaccine programs that are moving forward. However, not all of them are going to make it into candidate vaccine testing, and fewer into clinical trials, and even fewer into large-scale clinical trials. Mm-hmm. But we do think that it's very important for there to be multiple vaccines that are developed in parallel, because as of now, we simply don't know which vaccines will be the safest, and safety is the most important part about any vaccine, the safest, the most effective, and the most implementable in the world. There's different vaccine technologies that are being used, different ways of delivering vaccines, and so each of the different programs is really using a different technology. So our own technology that we're moving into human clinical trials involves a weakened form of a common cold virus called an adenovirus that we use to help bring a piece of the COVID-19 virus into cells. So what we do exactly is we take the most important piece of the COVID-19 virus, so not the whole virus, but just a single piece of it called the spike protein. If you've seen cartoons of the virus, it's basically the spike things that shoot out from all sides. So we take the DNA for that spike protein and we stitch it into an attenuated form of a common cold virus that doesn't cause any disease itself. But the reason why we do that is because the common cold virus helps to shuttle the COVID-19 spike protein DNA into cells. So it's used as a way of very efficiently getting the piece of the COVID-19 virus into cells where the protein is made, and the body makes an immune response to it. The reason why we think
Hey,
that's...
Dan, I
Yeah.
want to ask you a question about this so the writers get a sense of how to sort of story think it. So it strikes me that with your group that you've taken different pieces of the spike and attached it to the adenovirus, right? And so it's almost like you're telling us, you're coming up with stories like we do, like you're breaking down the virus into different stories that, you know, could have different outcomes. So you think in many ways like we do when we're breaking stories for our shows, that, you know, we think of our characters, and I almost think of the virus as a character, and you're thinking of different ways to come at the virus. So with that sort of perspective, is that what you did? I mean, because you didn't just take the spike, but you took different pieces of it, right? And tried different things, and you were thinking how in a sort of, what's the story that you were trying to put together as you were starting to think about how to attack making a virus?
So we really needed to know several things in order to know whether a vaccine is possible and whether our strategy would likely work. So one thing we need to know is which piece of the spike protein to use. So we looked at 6 different versions of the spike protein, and we basically made all of them, and we compared them. We looked at how well each one of them did in first in the laboratory and then in animal models. And based on those studies, then we were able to pick the best one to go forward into human clinical trials, which are scheduled to start next month. So that's one storyline. Another storyline is that we needed to know whether there actually is protective immunity to this virus. And what I mean by that is that we needed to know whether humans who are infected with COVID and recover, whether they are then resistant and whether they're protected against re-exposure. In other words, if any of us are infected with COVID and we develop antibodies, then are we then protected if we get exposed again? It's a critically important question for many different aspects. It's a critically important question from a public health perspective, and a critically important question that underlies the entire vaccine effort, because we know that viruses for which there is protective immunity, we know that it's much easier to make a vaccine. And if there's no natural protective immunity in humans, then it's very, very difficult to make a vaccine. So that's another storyline that we had to explore.
So in terms of HIV versus COVID, so what story can you tell us that makes you fairly convinced that you can do a COVID vaccine versus why it's been so hard? Because, you know, some of us might be worried that, hey, HIV's been around for, you know, decades now and there's no vaccine yet, even though you're working on it. So what's the difference so we understand that?
So I would say that we are cautiously optimistic that a COVID-19 vaccine is going to be technically possible, but we're still at the very early stages of the process. And vaccine development is notorious for having unexpected twists and turns and bumps in the road. So we don't know where the next chapter of this story is going to lead. What we do know is that it does not pose many of the same challenges that HIV does. And we've been working on HIV vaccines for 15 years, and some of my colleagues have been working on HIV vaccines for 30 years. And as we know, there's no vaccine today, not one that's clinically available.
So Dan, what are some of the other storylines in the sense of other people working on different kinds of vaccines? What are some of the other approaches?
So some people are developing COVID-19 vaccines based on purified proteins. In other words, just a purified piece of the virus with no carrier or anything, and just using that as a vaccine itself. There are some groups that are making so-called DNA vaccines or RNA vaccines, which means that the COVID-19 spike protein gene is put into either a DNA carrier or an RNA carrier. the RNA vaccine is, there are several RNA vaccines that are moving into clinical trials, one by a company called Moderna, one by a company called Pfizer, and there are also approaches in which a tried and true approach in which the virus itself is grown up and inactivated. And that's an approach that a group in China is developing. It's a tried and true approach to make vaccines. It's less popular in the United States because there are some more safety concerns associated with that approach. But there are multiple approaches. And the good thing is that the different vaccine approaches are complementary. And there are many different parallel strategies that are being pursued. The hope is that more than one will be successful. So the global vaccine effort has been characterized by some as a race. I actually don't think that we are racing against any other vaccine manufacturers. If there is any race at all, we're racing against the virus and the pandemic. But we actually hope that multiple vaccines will make it over the finish line and multiple vaccines will be successful. Because we have 7 billion people in this world, and no one vaccine is going to be able to cover everyone who needs it. The other storyline that's important, I think, is herd immunity.
Yeah.
In other words, we're in the middle of this global pandemic right now in the United States and in the world. And if anything, cases are accelerating in the world as a whole. Some areas of this country are improving, some areas are getting worse. But as a global, on the global scale, we are by no means out of the woods. We're in the thick of it right now. And the hope initially was that this virus would simply go away in a similar way that the original SARS virus did. But the ease of spread, the explosive spread, the spread from asymptomatic persons, and the inability of traditional public health measures to completely get rid of the virus, and the sheer penetrance of the virus in the human population suggests that this virus will likely not just go away. And there are likely 2 ways the pandemic will end. One is that the majority of people get infected, and one is the majority of people get vaccinated. And I'm not sure there's any other way the pandemic will end other than one of those 2 outcomes.
And can you paint a picture of what it's like in your lab? I mean, when you go in, I mean, the Harvard campus is closed, but you guys are operating 24/7. And I'm just curious as to know what it's like, just to paint a picture for the writers and everybody watching, what it's like in your lab, who the people are working there, what they're doing, what the morale's like. What's it like in your lab?
It's a completely surreal experience. It's nothing like I've ever experienced before in my experience as a doctor and as a scientist. Because in the lab, people are working with such commitment and such intensity, a degree to which I've never seen before, even at a place like Harvard Medical School, where there's obviously a very strong commitment to all research. Particularly during the period of shutdown. Imagine Boston and the Longwood medical area during rush hour that's completely empty. So I'm driving to work during rush hour on completely desolated, empty streets, arriving at busy research buildings that are completely empty, and then going into our own lab and having people working harder than they've ever worked before. So the juxtaposition of the intensity of the work that we have been engaged in and the shutdown of the vast majority of the research group is really amazing and striking, because Harvard Medical School shut down, like many institutions, shut down virtually all of research for several months. And the only work that's been allowed to continue is work that is directly responding to the acute COVID crisis, of which vaccine work is considered part of that.
Mm.
So the vast majority of groups have had their research labs shut, either fully or largely shut over the last several months. And yet our group is not only working, but working harder than ever before. No one's been required to do this. Everyone is doing this because they want to, because each and every person in the lab, whether they are the new graduate student or the technician or the senior scientist or anyone in between, everyone wants to help and everyone wants to use their time and knowledge and expertise and skills to try to contribute to a way to end this pandemic. And it's inspiring, it's surreal, and it's an experience like I've never seen before, to be working on a strategy to try to end this pandemic in the lab while the pandemic is raging and exploding before us on our doorstep right outside the building.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how are your friends and families coping with all this? That you all are so away from them so much of the time. It must be tricky.
Well, each person has their own story to tell, and each person has had struggles that they've had to overcome. Some people have sick parents. Some people have grandparents who have been infected with this virus and became very ill. Many of us, including myself, have had children home from school and trying to do online schooling at home. Many people are suffering from financial struggles during this time. And the actual lab work itself has been very, very different. Everyone's wearing a mask in the lab. People are trying to spread out, and instead of working in a busy lab shoulder to shoulder, because many of the labs are closed, people spread out across the floor to keep distance from each other. And so everything has been more complicated because of the pandemic and the shutdown. For example, just ordering supplies from different vendors. It's not as efficient because the vendors selling lab supplies, they're working on a skeleton staff. Having supplies delivered to the lab is more difficult because the people receiving packages in the docks are also working on a skeleton staff. So every step of the way is an order of magnitude more complicated and more difficult because of the pandemic and the shutdown. And yet I think it's a testament to the human spirit that the work still can get done and can get done quickly and effectively. And hopefully we've been able to make some important contributions to the scientific and the medical fields. And we don't know where things are going to go, but we certainly hope that these efforts will contribute to strategies to end this pandemic.
Neil, from what you know and from your medical experience and so forth in your work studying vaccines, is this we were talking about the global effort and the cooperation. Is this really unprecedented? Have you ever seen anything like this before?
Well, not a pandemic in terms of
Right.
my life, except for I think there are a lot of comparisons with HIV. So I've been asked, often will shows, have to turn to COVID and be post-COVID now? And I kind of look back on ER and I say, in the first 2 years of ER, there was no real treatment in 94, 95 for HIV. And we had characters who came on, stories where people died and we couldn't do anything. I did one in 1994 about that, where a young man came in with hiccups, and it turned out his liver was filled with abscesses from HIV. And who'd have thought a case of hiccups would end like this?
Right.
Inspired by something I had seen in Boston. And then with the triple cocktail and Gloria Rubin's character with HIV, everything changed. And so we didn't, change. We just continued and did stories about HIV post, having the various treatments available, and that changed the way we did the story. But we didn't stop telling the story. So I don't see how we're going to get around telling the stories now, because also what I've learned and seen is that COVID to me, it's like the pandemic is like a pressure cooker, and the fire underneath it really, blew the lid off with George Floyd's death. And the COVID pandemic really reveals the festering inequalities in healthcare that are provided, to people of color, particularly in the United States, who are dying at much higher rates, and for reasons of access and stigma, and not getting, treatment, so that they come in, sicker. So I think there are lots of stories that we've been telling about the disequal distribution of, or the unequal distribution of health care and medicine to minority communities, but it just makes it even clearer now. So that's something that we're going to have to think about. So I think the pandemic does, bring into clear relief stories that we have been telling, but not telling enough of, and
Right.
tell more. And I'm really interested in what's going to happen. I am concerned about, the anti-vaxxer movement as a pediatrician.
Right.
We did stories on SVU about how everybody has an opinion and everybody's opinion is okay. And I think that what we really need to focus on, and what I have always really admired about Hollywood Health and Society, is that we look at the science, and that the science grounds the storytelling that we do. And so I hope that we'll be able to tell stories, that are grounded in the science. And what's so challenging, as Dan has so eloquently talked about, is, we don't know everything yet. Nothing is definitive. As Dan was just saying, he has great studies on antibodies, and that we know they work in, primates who've been exposed to COVID and then are re-exposed, don't get sick. But is that the case for humans? And as human beings, we want answers. We don't like uncertainty. So this is all grist for our storytelling mill, that
Right.
we don't know what we know about vaccines per se. We don't know, who sheds and who is genetically susceptible, and there's so many questions. So I want to ask Dan about vaccine challenge trials, because I think it'll make a great storyline. Like, if I were working, like I have friends who do Instagram, or The Resident, like and the Good Doctor, like I think interesting storylines are like vaccine challenge trials, because these are trials where presumably young people who have the lowest, risk of morbidity and mortality are, given vaccines. And Dan can talk about how they want to speed up the trials, he can talk about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and that maybe we can, cut the time in getting these vaccines out by exposing people who voluntarily agree to be exposed to COVID after they've been vaccinated with a placebo or not. And, there are many ethical problems that Dan can talk about, but I think that that's a rich area for us to explore, because so Dan can talk about
the PBS NewsHour did a piece last night about young people volunteering for challenge trials. There's an organization called One Day Sooner, which has signed more than 28,000 people from 100 countries. But there are these issues that you're raising involved. There are moral issues about, exposing people to the virus, and also the issue of, younger people taking the vaccine when you don't really know for sure what the effect will be on the older population, which seems to have been more susceptible. So I'd be curious to hear what Dan has to.
If they get sick, what are we going to treat them with?
Yeah, exactly.
Dan can also talk about, so this raises so many stories. If we do vaccine challenge trials and people get sick, which they likely will if they're exposed to COVID, what are we going to treat them with, versus if we were doing a malarial trial on malaria? And also, do we know enough to do this so that if they go off and they're, asymptomatic, and they expose people who are, susceptible, what does that mean? So there are a lot of stories embedded in just something that sounds sort of simple. And also, should we pay people or not to do it? So who's going to volunteer?
Yeah. Well, apparently 28,000 people so far. Dan.
Well, I mean, there are so many stories there. And I guess, first I'll make a comment about storytelling. I think that from our perspective as scientists and physicians, we're very good at communicating with each other with charts and graphs and p-values. And in general, we are not very good at communicating with the general public. And so that's where I think, we're delighted to work with all of you folks in the storytelling community to tell these stories in a way that is accessible and engaging to the public. I think for many of these controversial topics, such as human challenge studies, the anti-vaxxer movements, then we as scientists and physicians are sometimes not the best ones to communicate. We can communicate the facts, but the way to actually communicate to the general public needs to be in the form of storytelling. And so I think that all of you folks really have an incredibly important job in helping to end this pandemic through the appropriate telling of accurate stories in a way that we are generally ourselves not very good at doing. So at first I want to thank you all for that. Regarding your question of human challenge studies, then in some cases they have been performed, such as Neil, you brought up for malaria, where vaccine studies in the field, so traditional clinical trials to show whether a vaccine works or not, are either impossible to do or very, very difficult to do. And typically, human challenge studies involve lowest risk people, such as potentially young, healthy people, who receive a vaccine or another intervention, and then willingly and knowingly are then infected with the virus or pathogen of interest, such as malaria. For malaria, it's a very good human challenge model. And the reason is because we can test for the malaria infection in the bloodstream essentially every day. And at the first sign that infection is taking hold, then they can be given drugs that cure malaria. And of course, the malaria that's used in the challenge study is a very highly regulated form of the malaria organism, and that we know for certain that the drugs are 100% effective for. So for malaria challenge studies, then it's actually a relatively low risk to the participant because we know we have drugs that can cure them. And in most cases, the people don't even get sick because they're caught even before they develop symptoms. For COVID-19, it's a different story because we don't have drugs that are definitive at curing COVID-19. There are some drugs that you probably have heard of that might show some partial effect on symptoms, but we don't have any drugs that we know are a definitive 100% cure. In fact, far from it. So if we do human challenge studies for COVID-19 as a strategy to accelerate vaccine development, then there's always a possibility that a volunteer, even if they're low risk, and there are young, healthy people who do have very, very severe disease and bad outcomes and even die from this disease. And then there's a possibility that there could be severe disease that we may not be able to cure. And the question from an ethical perspective is, are people allowed to accept that risk if they understand it and they want to accept that risk? I mean, people accept risk for many things. And so if someone is truly knowledgeable and can truly articulate that, yes, I know there is some risk of very severe outcomes, and if they still want to do it, then should they be allowed to do it? And there's actually no right answer, and there's arguments on both sides. So there is the ethical argument as to whether it would be ethical to do a human challenge study when we don't have what we would call rescue therapy. In other words, there's not a definitive therapy that can cure the disease if someone gets into trouble. Of course, for the individuals, they would be chosen as young, healthy people to have a minimal risk. But Michael, I think you brought up the scientific question, which is that if we show a vaccine works for these young, healthy people, does that actually mean the vaccine will work for the chronically ill, the elderly, who might actually not respond to a vaccine as well, might have a different course of illness? And that's also not completely clear. So for the human challenge studies, there are the ethical questions, but there are also the scientific questions as to whether that knowledge actually would accelerate vaccine development and approval. And clearly, if the human challenge studies will not actually help, in other words, they won't actually get to a vaccine any faster, then it simplifies the ethical question considerably. But there are actually not just ethicists and the lay public, but scientists and physicians are also split on this question. So there's no right answer. There's actually very good arguments on both sides. Right. And I think at this point, then a broader debate on that topic is certainly worthwhile. But there would need to be, I think, a lot of opinions vetted before such studies would go forward.
How would
I'm sorry, Neil, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. How does it speed up the challenge? Because I think people may not understand. Can you briefly tell us what it means? Because you're going to go through this phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and how would a human challenge trial speed things up?
So traditional vaccine development involves discovery in the laboratory, preclinical testing, typically in animals, and then someone will make a decision to go into humans. So then there will be manufacturing of the vaccine at a small scale, and the first stage of human clinical trials will be called phase 1 clinical trials to show safety and immune responses in small numbers of people. Then typically there would be a larger scale clinical trials, phase 2 clinical trials, that would look in maybe several hundred people for the right dose to use and the technical specifics of how to best give the vaccine, also confirming safety in a larger number of people. And then there would be larger definitive studies, which would be called phase 3 trials, which really demonstrate the effectiveness of a vaccine, as well as safety in large numbers of people, typically 10,000, sometimes tens of thousands of individuals. And those large studies are typically required to support licensure of the vaccine to make it available. So in settings where the large scale clinical trials simply can't be done, then the question is, would a human challenge study be potentially acceptable to replace a large scale human clinical trial? So the clinical trial series often takes years, and the entire vaccine development process for a new virus would typically take many years, even decades. So for COVID-19, vaccine groups are trying to shorten that as much as possible down to a single year. And the goal is to do that without compromising safety, because we can't compromise safety of a vaccine. Even in the context of a pandemic, I would argue safety is still the most important part of a vaccine.
Well, that goes back to, going back to Neil's point about the anti-vaxxers. I think one of their concerns is going to be, how safe can a vaccine be if it's been made so quickly? How do we know for sure that it's safe?
Yeah, that's a very important point. And I think, again, that's where I think storytelling is going to be so much more effective than charts and graphs and p-values. Because the charts and graphs and p-values really fail to communicate. While that might communicate very well to other doctors and scientists, I think that fails miserably in communicating with the general public. And so I think that's another area where storytelling is going to be even more powerful than the charts and graphs and p-values. But the central tenet of the anti-vax movement is that if vaccines are rushed, or if they're not done properly, and even sometimes if they are done properly, then they're still fundamentally unsafe. And trying to make a vaccine quickly essentially feeds into that narrative and leads to increase anxiety amongst the anti-vax movement that vaccines ultimately will not prove to be safe if they're rushed. I think that the issue is that the safety is not strictly determined by the amount of time it takes to make a vaccine, but is rather determined by the total person years of experience. For example, the phase 3 trials of these COVID-19 vaccines are likely going to take place in 30,000 people. So if you have 30,000 people for 6 months, that's still 15,000 person years of experience, which is still vastly more than a lot of vaccines experience for approval. For example, if you have a trial of 2,000 people that goes on for 5 years, that's only 10,000 person years of experience. So the goal in moving a vaccine quickly is to do so, but without compromising patient safety. And so how is it done? It's done by vaccine developers trying to work in parallel as many steps as possible rather than in series, and taking significant programmatic and financial risk. For example, many vaccine manufacturers are starting to mass produce vaccines now, even before they have any idea whether or not they're going to be effective. So that if they fail, then it's a huge loss of time, effort, and money, and millions of doses of vaccines that are sitting on the shelf will just be thrown out. Mm-hmm. But people think that that degree of programmatic and financial risk is acceptable and worth it to try to end this pandemic sooner. But I don't think that an element of safety risk is going to be worth it, and that's certainly not the intention.
So assuming we have a vaccine, let's look down the road and we have a vaccine that we can administer. Who gets it first? Who receives it first? And how do we pay for it?
That's an incredibly important question. And I think it's going to be, the answer is going to be, it depends on which vaccine is approved and the characteristics of the vaccine and how many vaccines. So it goes back to an earlier point I made that we have 7 billion people in this world, and we will need not one, but we will need multiple vaccines to be successful. One of the reasons is that the demand for the vaccine is going to be greater than the demand for any other vaccine, maybe even any other pharmaceutical product in history. And there is no experience manufacturing at this scale or distributing at this scale for virtually anything. Mm-hmm. But what we do know is that if a vaccine shows amazing safety and efficacy in humans, and if it can only be made at small quantities, then it's not going to achieve the medical need, which is to achieve herd immunity. Also, if vaccines are only going to be available at very limited quantities, it will result in huge ethical debates and conflict as to which groups, which countries, which states, which subsets of people get the vaccine and which don't get the vaccine. And there's no good outcome to that. The best solution is to have vaccines move forward that can and will be mass produced. And by mass production, I mean in the billions of doses. And to have that done as much in advance as possible, so that the time lag between showing clinical efficacy and having vaccines available for everyone who wants it will be shortened as much as possible. So the best solution to the question of who's going to get the vaccine and who's going to be denied getting the vaccine is simply to have vaccine technologies that allow mass production so you don't have to make that choice, to have enough vaccine for everybody who wants it.
Neil, I want to start factoring in some of the questions from our viewers, but I was wondering if you had anything you wanted to add or ask Dan.
Well, I think in telling the stories, Dan has really sort of emphasized this, which is we have to start with in some ways, the emotion, but make sure it's grounded in the science, so that, there's a lot of research now that shows that audiences don't pay attention to data. Scientists do, as Dan is saying, but we as storytellers know that. And so we have to lead with the emotional story, but it's really critical that we stay in touch with what the science is. And, it's not definitive, it's evolving. And so we have to even tell that story too, because I think people want a definitive answer. And, do I need to wear a mask or do I not need to wear a mask? And so the best knowledge we have is, yes, you do need to wear a mask. The best knowledge we have is that you do need to socially distance. So I think that's the step forward for writers, not only on COVID, but on all medical topics, and is to make sure we have the most accurate science as possible, but also acknowledge that it does change and it's fungible. So we have to accept that, and that's hard because we often have thought that science is just like concrete, but it's not. It's evolving. So I think that's really important for us to think about. And Dan, has made that really clear, that we need to turn to the scientists and then translate their stories. And there's a website that I go to called shotbyshot.org, and that's stories of vaccines that have saved people's lives. And that's what, I know, having written on medical series and all kinds of other series, that I'm always looking for that pungent story that, makes a difference. And so that's what we need too, to always be looking for those stories.
Well, that relates. I mean, one of the questions that we have here from from Jeannie is for you, Neil, specifically, which is how can we make the seriousness of this disease more understandable to the general public? And I think that goes back to the question of, how do we get people to observe social distancing and masks and to take this seriously?
And that's why I've been, involved from the very beginning with Hollywood Health and Society, because their mandate is to give information to film and TV writers to be accurate. I remember I did an episode about measles, and I turned to them and I said, how many kids have died in the past year? And I didn't know, but I wanted the information so that it was accurate, because we do know from many studies that people believe what we tell them on TV. We go to a lot of trouble to make ER look real, or New Amsterdam look real, or Grey's Anatomy look real. We dress the sets to look, authentic. And so people think that what we're saying is true. And so we have to be, I think we have a responsibility to them. So I think, learning as much as we can through these kinds of seminars, or going to HHS for more information, is really helpful. And always stories come out of it. Like, I can think of, as Dan was talking, so many stories about human challenge trials, because, there could be something where people are getting paid or not paid. And what about the trials in the past where, like Tuskegee and things like that. So, we can draw on lots of stories. So what we've done, in all the shows I've done, is that we turn to lots of consultants who are experts in the field, and we really, apply them for their stories. And, what I really respect, and I know this about Dan, is, I asked him why he does vaccines, why doesn't he do, so he can respond, why don't you do something else? Because I think, that's a really, profound story. He had a choice of doing any kind of medicine. So.
Dan?
Well, I think that history is on the side of vaccines, and vaccines are probably the most effective tool we have in modern medicine to end viral pandemics. Mm-hmm. Also my own background is before going to medical school, I studied immunology, which is the study of the human immune system. And so I always had a scientific curiosity of how the body's immune system works and how it can fight off diseases. And so I got into studying vaccines because I was interested in how, from a scientific perspective, the human immune system works. And when I was in medical school, I became very interested in global health, and particularly global infectious diseases. And since I graduated from medical school, there have been new emerging or re-emerging infectious diseases of global significance with a surprising and disturbing sense of regularity, whether it's MERS or SARS or avian flu or HIV/AIDS. Then the human species is going to be constantly bombarded with new pathogens. And our ability as doctors and scientists and as a general public to contend with new epidemics is not going to slow down. And if anything, pandemics will get more and more frequent because of globalization and international travel and climate change and many other features of our current society and planet. So the human species will always be bombarded with new pathogens, and some of them will take hold and cause epidemics. And vaccines is one of the, and maybe the best tool we have to combat that. And so my own motivation for studying vaccines is really to try to have the biggest impact possible in trying to improve global health.
Well, we're going to do HIV next week as our webinar, but nonetheless, there was a feeling that we had from one of our viewers that we sort of cut you off when you were describing the difference between HIV and coronavirus and why they're different, why the HIV vaccine has been so elusive.
Sure. So I'll give you a couple clear reasons. First, for HIV, we talked about the importance of showing whether the human immune system can contend with a virus. For HIV, in 30 years, there's not a single person infected that we know of that has been able to completely clear the HIV virus from their systems based on their own immune responses. So that's an example of where, as far as we know, there is no natural protective immunity to the virus. And the human immune system simply does not know how to cure and clear the virus. And that's one of the reasons why vaccine development is so hard for HIV. Let me give you one other reason. HIV has enormous sequence diversity. The sequences of HIV in a single person are more variable than global influenza, just as an example. So if we need a new influenza, a new flu shot every year, which maybe some of you get every year, if you need a new flu shot every year, then how could we possibly make a vaccine to a virus that has 10 times greater viral sequences? Essentially, it's not a single virus, it's millions, if not billions of viruses. For COVID-19, it's the exact opposite. We know that there is at least some degree of natural immunity in that most people who get the virus recover, and in most cases, recovery is complete. So we know that the human immune system can have at least some level of natural protective immunity. We also know that the amount of sequence differences for COVID-19 is not nearly as much as for HIV. There have been some mutations that have been described. You may have seen it written about them in the press. So far, none of those mutations appear to be a knockout punch for the current vaccines. It was always possible that moving forward, there could be some more mutations that could be problematic. But as of now, the amount of sequence diversity for COVID-19 is really quite minimal. And the mutations that have been described don't appear to be knockout punches. So I guess those are two clear reasons why we think that the development of a vaccine for COVID-19 stands a better chance of working than an HIV vaccine.
I had asked you earlier about what this was going to cost, and I really meant in terms of a healthcare provider covering the costs of the injection or whatever, and for individuals, what it was going to cost. But another one of our participants asked about what the cost is to the pharma, the big pharma companies who are underwriting a lot of this. I know Johnson & Johnson is underwriting your research at the moment, or at least a lot of it. What does this cost them? I mean, what are the costs like?
The costs are well over $1 billion
Yeah.
for each vaccine that goes
Mhm.
into mass production. The bulk of the costs is the production costs of the vaccine. There's of course research costs and early phase clinical trial costs. Those are obviously much lower than that. But the costs of mass producing millions, if not billions, of doses of the vaccine will definitely run in the billions of dollars range. And that's for each of the vaccines that gets to that stage.
Mhm.
And will we be able to, we don't have enough N95 masks. Will we be able to make enough vials? What are the challenges just in that element, that part of it, like the vials? Will your vaccine have to be refrigerated? What are the challenges there?
Will it be one or two shots even,
Yes.
will it be more than one shot?
So that's actually a question we don't know the answer to yet.
Mhm.
In early animal testing, then we believe one shot will be very very immunogenic. Two shots will probably be more immunogenic. So what will be the vaccine for humans? We actually don't know the answer, whether it'll be one shot or two shots. Most of the vaccine programs are going to go forward with a two-shot vaccine. For our program, it is not yet decided whether it'll be one shot or two shots.
Mhm.
But all those logistic questions that we may not think of become problems when you start thinking about scaling up to billions of doses. In other words, there aren't enough glass vials on the planet for 5 billion vaccine vials. There's not enough stoppers for those glass vials. And it's unclear whether it's even possible to make 1 billion or 5 billion or 10 billion glass vials with stoppers, let alone all the other aspects of how to store the vaccine, how to distribute it, and the syringes to administer it. So there are logistic questions that are things that many of us would not really think of as barriers. So obviously there's the scientific challenge of creating a vaccine that'll work and conducting the clinical trials. But the challenges associated with scale up to billions of doses is a logistic challenge that I'm not sure has ever been tackled before for virtually anything at that scale.
It's so worrisome given, just the lack of PPEs. But at least we have some time to think about it. And as you're saying, I'm sure you're involved in, and certainly Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca and the other big pharma companies are, obviously, and Gates thinking about this, because
Right.
what use is a vaccine if you can't distribute it?
Mhm.
Yeah. So the goal of a vaccine is to protect the individual, but even the broader goal of the vaccine is to vaccinate enough people to have herd immunity, and herd immunity is what will end the pandemic. And we certainly hope that can be achieved by vaccination rather than by the majority of people getting infected. Because if the majority of people have to get infected to achieve herd immunity, that will come with an enormous loss of life.
Here's a question that's from one of our viewers, but which also relates to something the three of us were talking about the other day, which is about antibodies. And the question is, why don't we know better yet whether or not the coronavirus, if you've had the COVID and then have the antibodies, how come we don't know more yet about whether or not they provide immunity?
So that's a very important question. And that really gets back to the question we've talked about a couple times in the hour about to what extent do human beings have natural protective immunity to the virus. So one of the studies that we did, which was in an animal model in macaques, is we said, well, we can address the question, we can get an answer to the question in macaques, because one question is what the virus does itself. And one question is the empiric question of, well, what level of immunity works in humans? So we showed that in monkeys that are exposed to COVID, they develop a viral pneumonia and then they recover. And then if we re-expose those animals to COVID a second time, then they are very well protected. So we actually proved the proof of concept that there is natural protective immunity to this virus in this primate model. We don't know for sure how that translates to humans, going to Neil's sort of uncertainty question, but it certainly shows that on a theoretical level, there is natural protective immunity to this virus. The reason why we don't know that for sure in humans is because it's actually something very difficult to prove, because we can't, at least as of now, we can't knowingly infect humans with this virus. And we talked about the challenges with a human challenge study. So the only way to generate that knowledge in humans would be to follow a large number of humans over a long period of time and just see whether humans who have recovered from COVID can get reinfected or not. And to do that in a convincing way would take a very large number of people for a long period of time. So hopefully that data will be generated, but it will take a substantial period of time before we know the answer to that for sure in humans.
What do other coronavirus studies show? So for instance, in SARS and MERS and monkeys, have you seen that in people, that people follow primates in terms of having, antibody immunity, or do we not know that yet in terms of other studies with monkeys and with primates and human beings?
In many cases, there are very strong parallels. And so our studies demonstrating natural protective immunity in primates, as well as vaccine protection in primates, while that doesn't guarantee that anything will work in humans, it certainly increases our optimism that the development of a vaccine for COVID-19 in humans is possible.
Neil, I had a question for you. Let me just find where it went. Oh, yeah. Here's a question for you. How did you make the transition from practicing medicine to writing about medicine?
I was doing both at the same time. So I was a writer. John Wells hired me on China Beach, and that was a show about nurses in Vietnam. And then I decided to leave. My son was a year old. I went to Harvard Medical School thinking I was going to be a pediatrician in Boston. And then John sent me the script for ER that Michael Crichton wrote in 1969 when he was a Harvard medical student. And it lay dormant for years. So the story goes in Spielberg's trunk, and someone found it and they made it. And, I ended up coming back from Boston, back to LA, to do ER while I was a fourth year medical student, and going back and forth doing clerkships and doing them on the weekends and during residency over 7 years at Children's Hospital, LA. And so I was able to integrate both. And, medicine is just like the best way to learn storytelling, because that's all we do as doctors is we're tracking down as detectives the symptoms and then trying to come to a conclusion, which is a diagnosis, and often going down the wrong paths, which was, always the case for like a show like House, where he went down the wrong path first and then he went to the right path. So medicine is just this, full of conflicts ethically, as Dan and I have been talking about, but also a great detective story in terms of figuring out what's going on and not, getting misled or, listening to, looking for zebras, we say, when we always like zebras when we're in medical school, which are the very unusual cases, but really they're horses, they're hoofbeats of the horses. So we shouldn't just jump to zebras. So I've been very fortunate in my career to have the intimacy of medicine, where you're hearing and sharing people's stories with other physicians and between the patient and the doctor, and then being able to translate that into shows on TV.
Neil, I have another question from someone asking about, just pointing out to you the idea as storylines, that there have been, that 70% of the deaths in Connecticut have been in nursing homes and assisted living facilities. Do you see that as a criminal story or a tragedy or both?
Both. I mean,
Yeah.
it's so we know that the deaths in LA are the preponderance is amongst African Americans and the elderly who are in tight quarters in nursing homes. And so those are stories we must tell. And I'm sure that I'm sure that they'll be told in medical shows. But that's always been another thing I've liked so much about Hollywood Health and Society is it's not just the medical shows that need to do,
Right.
because they do medicine, but a show like this, any show that's dealing with families is going to deal with an elder who may be in a nursing home and what happened and how did it happen and why did it happen and how could we have prevented it and why did we cover up the numbers. And I mean, just choosing nursing homes alone, we still don't even know. The CDC hasn't really released clear numbers on the deaths in nursing homes.
Right.
So that's a story. So stories are, COVID has given us so much to think about in terms of equity, but also in terms of cover-ups and access, and just as we were saying, PPEs being available, and to which kinds of hospitals. Well-funded hospitals and other hospitals we know have not gotten. Hospitals in inner cities have not gotten the same numbers of PPEs. So lots of stories to tell.
Well, this leads me to, I think, what's going to have to be our final audience question, but it's to both of you. It keeps jumping here on me. Hang on a second. Oh, okay, to both of you. Can you talk about the concern in detail about a potential second wave, especially in the US, and what would that look like? And if you were president and had a magic wand, what would you do to immediately improve the response in the United States?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, we're already seeing spikes. I'll go first because, from the storyteller perspective, we're already seeing it. So I don't know if it's not really a second wave. It's really the result of people having COVID, what we call COVID fatigue, and feeling sort of, more boisterous about going out because they haven't been sick. And what I say is that, COVID, when it began, and as Dan was telling the story, it was so fraught with uncertainty. And uncertainty compels us it compels our attention. It's like a great thriller. And we're on the edge of our seat and we want to know more and we want to know more. And as we get used to it, we kind of relax, and maybe I don't think we should be relaxing. So I give sort of another example. A story is 1,200 children die every day in the world from malaria. There's no panic. And as Dan said, that the reason is, one, we have we know what causes it, the mosquitoes that cause it. We know how to treat it. We know how to prevent it. We don't do a very good job of it. And it's also because it's someplace else and not here in the United States. But more children will die of malaria this year than from COVID in the United States. And so why are we not panicked about that? It's because we know about it. And as we think we know about COVID and we're used to it, and we see, the president and the administration and the doctors not wearing masks, we're showing a story and we're telling another story. So we have all these conflicts, but we're getting used to it. And so I'm very fearful that we'll see a second wave, because as Dan is saying, it doesn't disappear. It just is out there still and it pops up. So I'm very worried. I'm worried about production in terms of people being exposed, and also, what happens when, how can you really, conduct business when we don't know who's asymptomatic means we don't know who has it, and we don't know if they're, shedders. So again, so many questions, and it's very worrisome to me. I certainly appreciate the economic upheaval it's caused. And so how do we manage both? And I think we've learned that, we didn't have a spike until we sort of opened things up again. So again, distancing, masks, hand washing, not being enclosed areas like in Tulsa, things like that will, I think, help prevent it. It's not going to be as preventive as sheltering in place. But life has to go on. And, Black Lives Matter, life goes on in terms of the protests too. And we make these choices, as Dan was talking about, with human vaccine trials, that we weigh our risks. But there are lots of things we can do to reduce our risk.
Dan, closing thoughts?
Well, the first wave is certainly not over. Since the United States is a large country, then it's not a single epidemic. It's dysynchronous in that there are areas such as New York City that were hit really hard and now have a vast reduction in cases. And there's other areas that are just exploding right now, and other areas that are sort of petering along without any clear increase, but no clear decrease either. In Boston, we've had a significant reduction of cases, but by no means a complete reduction of cases. So it's unclear to me that there will be any defined end to a so-called first wave or a defined start to any second wave. But as Neil mentioned, when people let their guard down, then it is very much expected that there will be a spike in cases. It is almost inevitable. Now, hopefully it won't be nearly as big a spike in cases as we saw in April, but there are still, the vast number of people are still susceptible, which means that there can be outbreaks. And if there's a lot of testing, then we hope those can be caught very, very quickly. And if there's not sufficient testing, then they could spread substantially to a point where it's not easily controllable again. So I don't think it's as simple as a first wave and a second wave. I think that there will be continuous pockets of escalating cases and diminishing cases, almost more like a game of whack-a-mole, where things keep coming up and we try to get them to go down, but then as soon as one place goes down, another place comes up again. But certainly any sort of large gathering of individuals will be a risk for further spread of the virus. And so I think that process will continue. There has already been some sort of normalization of COVID-19, but I would argue that having nearly 1,000 people die a day in the United States is not a normalization we want to accept. And ultimately, I think that our best hope to end the pandemic ultimately is going to be a vaccine.
And when, just to, not to hold you to anything, but what would be your optimistic assessment of when that would be available to the public at this point?
So there's been a lot of discussion about the timing of a vaccine. And I think that given that the large phase 3 clinical trials will start next month with one vaccine, and then a second one likely start in August, and then a third one likely start in September, and possibly one or two others this year as well, then there is a chance that there could be positive results of these efficacy trials this fall or this winter. And if the companies can mass produce the vaccines well in advance, then it's theoretically possible that there could be some sort of limited emergency use authorization, perhaps as early as this winter, and the larger scale distribution of the vaccine in early 2021. But that requires everything going absolutely perfectly from this point forward. And I should emphasize, we're still at the early stages. Until we actually demonstrate that the vaccine is safe and effective in human beings, then there will be a lot of uncertainty. And we really don't know whether all of these vaccines are going to succeed, or none of them are going to succeed, or maybe a subset will succeed. So the timelines will be refined as we go forward. But I would submit to you that sometimes in science and medicine, not everything goes perfectly the first time.
Well, listen, thank you both very much. This has been incredibly illuminating and informative, and I just value you both being here so much, and it was so great. For the people who are watching, there is a survey that will pop up at the end of this, and that you will also receive as an email that we'd like you to take, assessing these webinars. As I mentioned, next week's subject is going to be HIV. And listen, I especially want to thank all the people at Hollywood Health and Society, and Marty Kaplan, and Kate Fald, and Lenka Gopal, and Melissa Gattuso. They've always been just great about making these things run like a clock. And so I thank them, I thank Neil, and I thank Dan, and just great. Thanks so much, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Stay safe.
Be well.